So let me start off proceedings. You're all very welcome. I'm Cliona Saidlear. I'm the Executive Director of Rape Crisis Network Ireland, and I'm really happy to welcome you here today to our the launch of our 2021 National Rape Crisis Statistics. This is something of an annual event for us, but it's also very different every year. And we really take the time to reflect and ask, well, what is it we need to and will be of benefit to say this year in particular. And so I'm delighted that we have both Elaine Mears here to walk us through the RCNI data, and also Bernard Gloster, the CEO of Tusla, the Child and Family Agency, who's going to reflect on what this tells us and what it means for us going forward. As we work through the data. So just a few bits of housekeeping first. We have sign language. We have Lisa with us today. Lisa, normally there's two of Lisa. So Lisa is on her own today. So we're all going to try to slow down a little bit, just to support her in terms of being able to get through what is a very complex, sometimes complex piece of information. So she's doubly challenged today, but very much up. We have every confidence in her. If you can't see her, and if you're looking to, if you need the sign language and you can't see her as we go through, because we'll be sharing screens, etc., do let us know. We'll put something in the Q&A there, and we'll come back to you. And we'll try to support you to figure out how to put her in the spotlight. I would encourage you to, if you have questions, to put those questions in the Q&A as we go along. I will come to them at the very end of the session. But if something occurs to you as we go, please don't wait till the end to put that question to us. It'll also give us, if it's a particularly difficult question, Elaine will be able to go off and research it by the time we get to the end and the Q&A itself. So the lineup today is I'm going to hand it over very shortly to Elaine, who is going to walk us through the data itself. And then we're going to go to Bernard Gloster, who's going to reflect upon the data as well, as Elaine has laid it out for you there. We then are going to look more reflectively on a number of pieces there and have a panel conversation about what they mean and what they might mean, what we understand by what that data is telling us. And then we want to open it more to the floor, to you and the Q&As. So we look forward to any and all engagement you have there around the Q&As. So the first thing, just in terms of introducing Elaine first, that she's, as I say, she's our data person in the RCNI. We're very delighted to have her back. One of the things that we're doing in this particular annual rape crisis statistics launch is we're reflecting on 3 years. We're reflecting from 2019 through to 2021, the end of 2021. And obviously that was an extraordinary period for all of us. And one of the things that happened for the RCNI is that we managed to get, with extra funding, we got Elaine back in to our staff team. And what she was able to do and to bring to us was very immediately and rapidly bring almost real-time data to bear on the crisis as it emerged, and as the rape crisis centres evolved and responded, and survivors themselves changed in terms of how they were accessing and how they're reaching out to us and how they were gaining the supports that they needed around the pandemic as it evolved. So that was, and today what we're trying to do then is reflect on the 3 years. And as Elaine, in our reflections in preparation for this pointed out, there's essentially two strands here, two stories here. One is the story that we often focus on, particularly around this, which is what survivors are telling us. It's what they're telling us about abuse, what they're telling us about sexual violence. And as Elaine reflected, one of the things that has stayed constant is the nature of that sexual violence, and she's going to take us through the stats on that and the evidence on that. And it all bears repeating, because one of the things that we've been trying to do over the years is understand how we need to disaggregate and how we need to understand this data so that we can respond better and understand how differences need to be responded to. But the second story, of course, is how rape crisis responded. This is also the story of rape crisis centres, and that in terms of how survivors are accessing, how the services are responding, is really the other story in here, and we're delighted, as I say, to have Bernard Gloster with us, in particular around that side of the story. In many ways, this report is the RCNI's an annual event for the RCNI, but it's not actually about the RCNI at all, because it is first and foremost about every survivor that walks into a rape crisis centre. It is their story, it is their voice. And it is, of course, then, as Elaine will, I'm sure, as soon as I give her credit, she will pass it on to the people in rape crisis centres who input this data, the counsellors, each individual counsellor, but also in particular the data collection officers, and the whole infrastructure that Elaine connects in with, in terms of making sure that this data is the most up-to-date data, measures what it needs to measure, captures fully what is happening, captures fully what survivors are telling us, and it's that feedback loop and that community that creates this database, and it really is their story as well. So really, this annual RCNI event is very little to do with us. We're simply the facilitators of something else. So on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Elaine, who's going to walk you through the statistics themselves. So I think she's sharing screen first. There we are.
Thanks, Cliona. So as Cliona says, this 2021 report, it's really the story of 3 years. It's the story of how rape crisis centres responded to the pandemic, and as well as telling the pattern that we see year on year that survivors disclose to us. So it just didn't make sense for us to present 2021 data and compare it to 2020, as we do every year, because 2020 was such an outlier, and everything changed for us. Everything changed in how rape crisis centres provided services and how survivors came to rape crisis centres and accessed them. So just for some headline figures, we had 11,414 helpline contacts were made to 6 helplines in rape crisis centres in 2021. Now, just to say that this 11,414, this really only represents about a quarter of all of the helpline contacts that are made to 16 rape crisis centres across the whole of Ireland. There is only one helpline which is actually funded to provide services within Ireland, and that is the 24-hour helpline, which is run by the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. So these 11,414 contacts, they were provided free of charge and on a voluntary basis by rape crisis centres. That's a 7% increase in helpline contacts from pre-pandemic times, or from 2019. And when we look at the actual time spent on phone calls alone, that's 27% increase in the times spent on calls compared to pre-pandemic times. So 1,341 people took up counselling and support in rape crisis centres in 7 rape crisis centres in 2021. This was a mixture of survivors and supporters. This represented 14,280 appointments which were provided, and that is an 18% increase in appointments when we compare it to 2019. Rape crisis centres provided 183 accompaniments. Now, accompaniment is when someone from a rape crisis centre would accompany a survivor to court, to the Gardaí, or for a sexual assault treatment unit or something like that. This is a 6% increase in accompaniments when we compare to pre-pandemic levels. RCNI's Legal Policy Director, Caroline Coonahan, provides legal advice and information consultations to survivors, to supporters, and also to the staff and volunteers in rape crisis centres. And in 2021, she provided 151 of these. So let's dig into the detail of the helpline contacts to really to understand what was happening in 2021 And how does it compare to the previous 2 years? So what we have here is we have 2019 is the green line that we see here. 2020, which was the first year of the pandemic, is this yellow line, and we can see some really clear peaks there in certain months of the year. And then we have the purple line, which is 2021. So we can clearly see from this that 2021 levels, they weren't as dramatic as 2020. They have reduced to something more akin to 2019 levels. However, in 9 out of 12 months, the levels were still higher. We received more helpline contacts than in 2019, previous to the pandemic. And overall, that's a 7% increase from 2019. So who is contacting Rape Crisis Centre helplines? We clearly see here the majority of people contacting are survivors of sexual violence, 78%. We see 7% are someone who is supporting a survivor. And then we see this 12% figure of professionals. So what this 12% speaks to is the really important role that rape crisis centres play within their community as experts on sexual violence and experts in responding to sexual violence, and to the huge amount of interagency work that they do and how they're relied on within their communities. Then we turn to the method of helpline contact. So how are people contacting rape crisis centres, and how has that changed over this 3-year period? In 2019, we can see that the vast majority of people were making contact by voice calls. In 2020, this changed. So the number of voice calls, or the ratio of voice calls, reduced, and it instead increased. The number of text messages increased. And we see that trend then continue into 2021, where 48% of contacts were voice calls or video calls, and 47% were text messages. And what this speaks to is how rape crisis centres immediately responded to survivor needs during this pandemic, how counsellors gave their phone numbers to survivors and allowed them to have direct contact with them through this very difficult time. We see that the length of time spent on calls to rape crisis centres has increased over the 3-year period. It's increased by 27%. So we have, in 2019, there were 647 hours spent on helpline contacts. This increased dramatically in 2020 to 1,104 hours, and it reduced in 2021 to 822. But that 822 hours, that's a 27% increase from the 2019 figure. And let's look at the pattern of these calls. So in 2019, prior to the pandemic, we see most calls there, 77% were between 0 and 5 minutes, so short calls. In 2020, this changed. We've seen the calls, shorter calls decreased and longer calls actually increased. And again, this trend has continued into 2021, where we have a trend for longer calls to helplines. When we look at the accompaniment services that rape crisis centres provide, we see a 6% increase between the pre-pandemic levels and 2021. And we also see a difference in what type of accompaniments were being provided. So prior to the pandemic, we had 65% of accompaniments were to sexual assault treatment units, 24% were to the Gardaí, and 11% to court. This changed in 2020, and quite understandably, because our personal contact had to be decreased because of the pandemic. So we've seen a reduction in accompaniments to sexual assault treatment units and an increase in accompaniments to the Gardaí. And this trend continued into 2021, where we see 45% of accompaniments were to a sexual assault treatment unit, 35% were to the Gardaí, and 20% were to court. This figure here refers to the legal advice and information clinic provided by RCNI's Legal Policy Director, Caroline. So what Caroline does is she provides support to survivors through the criminal justice system, and she also provides support to the staff and the volunteers in rape crisis centres who are supporting these survivors, as well as information on governance and training. And we see there's quite an even split there. 50% of the support that she provided was to rape crisis centre staff and volunteers, and 50% was to survivors of sexual violence. So as I said, 1,341 people attended rape crisis centres for counselling and support in 2021. Now, when we look at this in detail, we see the vast majority, 89%, were survivors and 11% were supporters. This made up 14,280 appointments for counselling and support, which was an 18% increase in the number of appointments when compared to 2019. And when we look at the detail behind this, when we look at the pattern behind those appointments, we start to see a story emerge. So every single month of 2021, which is that purple line there were more appointments than in 2019, which is the green line. We can clearly see differences from the yellow line, 2020, where we had big peaks in April and in June. And this graph really tells a story, I think. So looking at January in 2021, that was a really tough month. We had gone back into lockdown. You know, survivors' coping mechanisms are eroded. So we see a greater dependence on rape crisis centres for counselling and support. And we really see that link actually when we compare the months of increased demand in rape crisis centre to what was happening in the real world, what was happening in society out there. And again, in April, we see another slight peak here. And the reason that we think that happened is because we were coming out of another lockdown, schools were returning, survivors had more time to actually engage with their trauma and to engage with the rape crisis centre. The vast majority of people who come to rape crisis centres are women and girls. So 89% of survivors are women and girls, and 11% are boys and men. And when we look at the age breakdown of survivors, we see that 17% were under the age of 20, and 9% of survivors were actually under the age of 18. The majority are in that 20 to 29 age group, so 32%. And then we see another significant group within the 30 to 49 age group. Rape crisis centres provide services to marginalised communities and people with additional vulnerabilities. And we provide detail on this every year, even though in some cases, because the numbers are so low, we often cannot provide a huge amount of information, but we provide whatever information that we can because we feel it's incredibly important to give voice to marginalised groups within society. 7% of survivors, or 89 people, had a disability. 4% were seeking international protection or had been granted international protection. 7% of girls and women who were over the age of 10 and who had been subjected to rape became pregnant as a result of that rape. 5% of survivors were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And a small number, less than 1%, were members of the travelling community. So now let's look at the patterns of sexual violence. Year on year, we see similar patterns emerging. So when we look at the differences in gender, the differences between boys, men, and girls and women, we see a clear pattern emerge. And what we see is that the vast majority of boys and men who come to rape crisis centres were subjected to child sexual violence. Whereas when we look at women and girls, we see a different pattern. We see that 44% were subjected to child sexual violence and 40% were subjected to sexual violence in adulthood. But what's also really interesting here are these two figures, this 9% and 16%. And these are people who were subjected to sexual violence in both childhood and adulthood. And it speaks to something really important here in terms of effective prevention strategies. And it also speaks to how important it is to ensure that when a survivor discloses sexual violence, that they are met with compassion and belief. And this will in turn ensure that, or help at least, them to not have to go through a further experience of sexual violence. So sexual violence is perpetrated against different age groups of survivors in distinctly different ways. So when we look at the under 13s against teenagers and against adults, we see very distinctive patterns of abuse. So what we see in the under 13 age group, and it's important to say that it's girls and women who are actually driving the trends in all of these patterns or in all of these locks. The boys and men are for the most part visible in this under 13 age group. So what we see is in the under 13s, the majority are disclosing sexual assault as the form of sexual violence. Whereas when we look at teenagers, we see something different. We see that 62% are disclosing that rape is the form of sexual violence. And then this increases again when we look at adults, and we see 75% are being subjected to rape. So what this says to us is that girls are increasingly more vulnerable to more extreme forms of sexual violence as they age. When we look at the duration of abuse, or the length of time over which the abuse was perpetrated, again, we see a similar pattern emerge. The under 13s are telling us, or people who were subjected to abuse when they were under the age of 13, tell us that the sexual violence was perpetrated over years, over many years, 83%. Whereas for teens, the age 13 to 17, the majority are saying that the sexual violence is perpetrated over a number of hours. And then this increases again when we look at adults, and we see that 70% of those subjected to sexual violence in adulthood said that the abuse was perpetrated over a number of hours. When we examine additional forms of violence, so other forms of violence that the survivor was subjected to along with the sexual violence, survivors tell us 54% of survivors were subjected to these other forms of violence. And what we see when we look at the different age groups, that emotional and psychological violence is the most common form across all of these people who were subjected to additional violence. In the under 13s, we have a really high level. 64% of them were subjected to emotional and psychological violence, 59% of teenagers, and 40% of those over the age of 18. So where is this violence taking place? The under 13s are telling us that the sexual violence is for the most part taking place in the survivor's home or in the perpetrator's home. When we look at teenagers, we see something different happen. So we see the sexual violence begin to move outside of the home. We see for the most part, it's actually happening outside or in a car. Then 26% are disclosing other locations. That includes a friend's house, it includes schools, pubs, nightclubs, in a workplace. And then we also see the perpetrator's home and the survivor's home are pretty high figures there as well. When we look at survivors of abuse in adulthood, we see that the majority were subjected to the violence in their own homes. 33% then said they were subjected to the violence in other locations. And the most common location there is a friend's house. We also have a pub and a workplace there. So again, we're seeing the similarities here between the teenagers and the adults constantly. Gender of perpetrators. This is a common variable we see every year, and it's a really critical variable in terms of ending sexual violence and who we target with prevention programs and education. So 97% of perpetrators are boys or men, and 3% are girls or women. When we look at the relationship between the perpetrator and the survivor, the under 13s are for the most part telling us that the perpetrator is a family member or a relative. The teenagers are telling us that it's usually a friend, acquaintance, or neighbor. And this trend continues into adulthood, where it's again a friend, acquaintance, or neighbor. Now, another figure to really pay attention to here is the partner or ex-partner figure. So teenagers are those subjected to abuse when they were teenagers. 19% were subjected to that abuse by a partner or an ex-partner. And when we look at those subjected to abuse as adults, 24% were subjected to the sexual violence by a partner or an ex-partner. Now, we're constantly looking for patterns within our data. So one of the clear patterns that we see is the difference between those who are subjected to sexual violence in a domestic violence and coercive control setting, so by a partner or ex-partner, and then those who are subjected to sexual violence by someone other than a partner or ex-partner. So what we've done here is we've just created a comparison between the two. So we can see for those who were subjected to the violence by a partner or ex-partner, the survivor is usually a woman. They are usually have been raped. 86% disclose that they have been subjected to additional forms of violence, and it's mostly emotional or psychological. The violence takes place over years. It usually takes place in the survivor's home or in the perpetrator's home. Often they're a shared home. The relationship, of course, is a partner or ex-partner. It's usually a man who is perpetrating this violence. And it takes usually about 5 years between the sexual violence happening and the survivor coming forward to access a rape crisis centre. And we see 30% of survivors of coercive control and domestic violence report to a formal authority or to the police, where we see a completely different pattern for those subjected to abuse by non-partners. We see much lower levels of additional violence, 31% compared to that 86% figure. We see the abuse takes place over hours as opposed to years. There's more variation in the location of abuse. There's a completely different relationship to the perpetrator. And also the person usually comes forward to access services sooner than someone who is in a domestic violence relationship. And also higher levels of reporting there, 42% compared to 30%. When we look at the age of perpetrators, we see that 83% are over the age of 18, but 17% are children, are under the age of 18. Now, another pattern that we have seen is that usually perpetrators of sexual violence target someone around the same age as themselves or slightly younger. And we really see that come through when we look at perpetrators who are under the age of 18. 38% of survivors who attended services reported the sexual violence to a formal authority. The vast majority of these reported to the police, so on Garda Síochána and PSNI or other police forces. And I'm going to leave it at that. And predictably, as Cliona said, I would like to thank, first and foremost, the survivors who give their voice and lend their voice to this collective story. It's a hugely important piece of information and story to tell. And we don't take that lightly. There's great responsibility in our job doing that. A huge thank you as well to our data collection officers who work tirelessly to input the data, to check the data, to make sure it's accurate and to clean the data. To all of those who support and fund rape crisis, the movement, and to everyone within the movement as well, to the managers, the staff, and the volunteers who keep our doors open. Thank you.
And thanks for the invitation to be with you this afternoon in what is a very powerful and informative demonstration of information on such an important topic, and a topic which unfortunately requires the level of attention it does, but fortunately is also now receiving an increased level of attention. And I think that is in part to do with the increase in the publication and availability of data, such as here this afternoon, as well as with the attention to issues of sexual violence alongside and with domestic violence during the course of the pandemic. And there is no doubt the international evidence has much to tell about that. I think the way Elaine has presented the data from the report this afternoon also makes it very accessible. And while it is data from 7 of the 16 rape crisis centres in Ireland, I do think it is a credible basis of trend. I do think it's a credible basis of evidence. And it is one from which we can draw some conclusions. There is no doubt that we need to constantly take data like this and put it with other data sets that might be available, including from some of the individual centres that aren't covered in the 7 here. But ultimately, the emerging trends and the somewhat more obvious conclusions are reinforced by the evidence here today and also by other sources. And so I think it is important that this information is given serious weight and is considered carefully. I think considered carefully not just by public service organisations or senior public servants like me, but perhaps more importantly by the discourse around safeguarding in society, around sexual violence, and around many of the issues and taboos that have surrounded that in the past. From the data this afternoon, a couple of things that strike me that are really important. Data is very often just data. And sometimes when we take it a little bit further, it becomes what we might call information. I think what you have sought to do this afternoon is to go that final step and to turn it into knowledge. In other words, knowledge that will inform what it is we might do in the future, what we might do as a society, what our political system might do, what our public service organisations might do, what the NGOs on which the rape crisis model is built might do. There is no doubt the survivor experience is an important part that comes through the data. What it tells us about people accessing services and also about access to services is something that we do need to consider and consider carefully. I'm very struck by the length of time taken on the calls post-pandemic versus pre the pandemic. And I think what that does is reflects the complexity of the experience with which survivors are coming forward. Some coming forward perhaps because of experience during the pandemic, but others, like the many Elaine pointed to, who may have been 4 or 5 or 6 years from their experience of sexual violence to coming forward to seek help and support. Even that of itself, we have to reflect on what was it about the period of the pandemic, what was it about the period of sustained lockdown and altered interactions from our normal support networks. What was it that brought people forward, and what is it in the complexity of their story that shows they require more time and more support? And rightly so, if they require it, that should be available to them and should be the priority for all of us to do. Minister McEntee in her third strategy talks very much about the 4 Ps of bringing together prevention, bringing together protection, bringing together prosecution, and bringing together policy. And that ultimately is the direction of travel into which we must now pursue the issues that arise out of this report and many others over recent times. We have to consider very carefully that while investing in prevention is so important, right from the earliest of education up to how we challenge social media and other platforms in which people now access information, there is no doubt we have a long way to go to increase investment in the protective response to people. And the protective response into domestic violence setting might well be in starting in a refuge and subsequently accommodation and counselling. But the protective response in sexual violence also has to include the protection of the emotional well-being of the person, the counselling and the support that they receive through the Rape Crisis Centre model. And of course, thankfully, we've seen more visibility to the types of prosecutions that the Gardaí and the Director of Public Prosecutions have mounted in more recent times. The bringing together of everything in policy setting is a real challenge for the third strategy, because on the one hand, we must try to have a coordinated approach, and on the other, we have to make sure that every state agency and every sector of society plays its part, and that it's not simply seen to be the responsibility of somebody else over there. For Tusla, I guess our two roles that are reflected in some of the data today. Firstly, we're the principal funder of the Rape Crisis Centre models across the 16 centres across Ireland. And I think it's important that we do everything for the duration of time that brief remains with us prior to the establishment of a new agency, which we very much welcome and support and are working towards with Minister O'Gorman and Minister McEntee in government. But while waiting for that, it's important we don't wait for or sit back and think the panacea of new structures. It's important that we press on. It's important that we emphasise all that we can, be that in money, or be that in time, or be that in training, or be that in professional discourse, but that we continue to support the work of the response to people who experience sexual violence. And so Tusla has, at least for the next year, a critical role to play in that. And I want to thank my own staff who, in a small team, commit to that every day. I know that there's additional allocation due to Tusla specifically to support Rape Crisis Centre work, and I look forward to seeing and sharing further detail of that with people in the coming weeks. But there is no doubt also that Tusla has another role very evident in the data today. Not only do we receive reports under the mandatory reporting mechanism of the legislation for the purpose of protecting children today, but there is no doubt that we have to be focused on, concerned about, and interested in the data you've provided about the experience of children and young teenagers who experience sexual violence, and the many places they experience it, and the many forms in which they experience it. As the State Child Protection Agency, it has to be of primary concern to us. And I will go further to say the attention, again in recent times in media inquiry and media narrative, also to children who are seen to act out in a sexually harmful and violent way towards others, is something that equally has to be of concern, because that too has its origin in what is no doubt a very complex and increasingly complex society in which children grow up and in which they learn and in which they develop. But the experience of children who use rape crisis centres and similar types of supports is something that's very significant and very evident in this report, and one that we have to remain live to all of the time. I was also struck in the data by the use of the legal services and legal advices of people, and I would be interested to see further what the experiences of people who seek and use legal services and advices are. There is no doubt that victims of sexual violence, like so many other victims of crime, require a different approach and a different level of response from legal services for a whole variety of reasons. And that work was I think, very significantly reflected by Tom O'Malley in his seminal report, and which is now influencing some of the direction into the future. What people are telling us ultimately is perhaps what's evident in this data, and what our capacity is and is not to respond over a 3-year period is quite significant. The comparative analysis that Elaine pointed to of 2019, when most of us had never heard of a pandemic, into 2020, when we saw that very short and sharp shock in the middle of March, and all that has meant for society right up to early 2022, and indeed today, in terms of still the prevalence of COVID-19 as we face into the winter. What did that mean for so many people? What did it mean for victims of sexual violence? What did it mean for people who need other services? Because of course we know that people who experience domestic and sexual gender-based violence in all of its forms, they don't just need the response of the provider, be it the rape crisis centre or the domestic violence provider. They need the response of so many services and the consideration of so many services. The response of the health services, be that in forensic or SATU work, sexual assault treatment unit work, or be that indeed in specialist areas of psychology and adult counselling and adult mental health services. They need the response of the Gardaí if they report crime and how that crime is investigated and considered. The response of the courts, the response of the media, and the response of society to the increasing focus, as I said at the start, to the discourse around sexual violence and its prevalence and what it means for us. That prompts us, and today's report from 7 centres prompts us to pursue wider and data that even reflects greater the totality of interactions with survivors. I've no doubt that that's something that will grow and mature in the time ahead, but it is something that we must be committed to ensuring, because there is no doubt that evidence and evidence-informed planning of services is so critical. I had the enormous pleasure, albeit in the context of COVID-19, in March of 2020, of engaging directly with the rape crisis centres across Ireland and the domestic violence providers. And both of those have a unique relationship that some might say they go hand in glove, and others would say there's an important need to recognise the uniqueness of both as issues and as provider responses. But throughout that time, it's very obvious to me in the number of times that I engaged with the sector directly to attempt to articulate the state support for the sector during that very challenging time. There is no doubt that we're very fortunate in Ireland in rape crisis centres, like we are in so many other things in personal social services, to have something that had its origins in voluntarism, had its origins in local response, and has now become, and increasingly become, a very professional, well-established, and no longer singular in a county, but indeed network and grouping of services. That can only be a good thing. How we utilise that is the responsibility of all of us to make it better and to make it as best as it can be. And that's the journey of continuous improvement for public services in Ireland as we move out of the years post that period that will be known as COVID-19 or as the pandemic. And I do, in conclusion today, want to say that it's important we stand back and remember the people behind rape crisis centres in Ireland, the people who are at the end of the phone, the people who are at the door of that local centre, the people who do go out to do the accompanying visits, the people who do go and try to give support when other supports aren't available, the people who advocate, the people who ultimately are there for people in what can only be described as the most private and yet challenging a period in their lives when they're dealing with their own personal experience of sexual violence, and where thankfully they find the responsiveness of rape crisis centres across this country to be a responsiveness that will go to whatever degree it needs to go to try to advocate for and support that person in that experience. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bernard, for that really comprehensive reflection. And I'm almost afraid to say, and let's keep talking, because I think you've covered so much there, and I think we could just reflect on your reflection there. And it's just really great to have someone in your location who's just paid that attention to the issue and to the infrastructure around this, and to really engage with the need around this and to understand it in the way that you clearly do. But having said that, we do have some questions and answers in, but I think first we were saying we want to reflect in more depth on one or two questions just to explore them. I think you've touched on some of the issues already, but if I might share the screen here and just walk you through, and I'll bring Elaine back in for this as well. Oops, I stopped sharing instead of playing the double job, and I don't know why it's not playing. There we are. Lovely. So one of the things we were curious about is, in terms of myself and when I was looking at these, and I was curious about getting your reflection on them, and maybe Elaine as well. I just paused on one or two of the slides that Elaine had pulled together in terms of the statistics. And one of them for me is this one here, which talks about the helpline contacts. And obviously we've dwelled on this already. Both Elaine and yourself have looked at how that spiked and how that happened in 2020. The levels are up, how they're still up in 2021. But I suppose my key thoughts around this is the question around access, around what it tells us about how survivors accessed rape crisis centres, how they find their way to a rape crisis centre. As I say, we have noticed that the levels have not gone back to the 2019 baseline. They're still up, and I suppose we can expect that they will continue to go up. This is a trend that has been an upward trend, and I know when I was doing the radio this morning, the question is always asked of us is, why do we think they're increasing, and do we expect them to keep on increasing in terms of these numbers and in terms of access? So I suppose I just wanted to reflect on that and ask you your thoughts, and also your wider experience across Tusla in terms of the access and the way that people accessed and the way that services responded.
Sure. I think it's a very complex question, and I think some of my professional staff would certainly probably have more competence and insight into the nuances than I would have. But one of the things that strikes me is that this is fundamentally about reporting and disclosure, and so we've seen an increase correspondingly in retrospective cases, that's adults reporting experiences of childhood abuse, and so the figures you have here reflect that. But I think the fundamental point of your question is 2021, leaving aside the spike of parts of 2020, but 2021 versus 2019, what is that about? And I would speculate, and I stress it's a speculative answer, but I would speculate it is as much about the increased level of awareness to the possibility of reporting, an increased level of awareness of the possibility of the type of response that might come on reporting. And if I was to take a comparative position, before I came to Tusla, it was just shortly before I came to Tusla, was the introduction of mandatory reporting in respect of child abuse generally for prescribed professions. And I think people thought the roof would fall in with referrals that would come after mandatory reporting. And of course, that didn't turn out to be the case. In fact, if anything, what we saw was an exponential growth in referrals about welfare considerations for children. But the reason mandatory reporting didn't cause a massive increase at the time was because Ireland had, on a voluntary basis for 20 years before that, aspired to the different principles of children first, and so a culture of reporting had developed. And I think I'm open to other views on this, but I do think that the pandemic, the attention to issues, the importance of getting help, I think all of those converge in such a way that people do now feel and believe that the importance of reporting and the importance of the response you get when you report is as important in that line as what it might just simply suggest about prevalence. So that's just a thought on it from other mechanisms. And as I say, there could be much more to that I wouldn't even be hitting on.
I think all good data probably begs more questions than it answers. All the best data. Elaine, if I could just ask you, just because Bernard, you mentioned earlier about the length of time of the calls and how that was, in some ways, that graph about the length of time of the calls is the sister graph to this, because this is purely the number of calls. And I suppose one of the things to explore with yourself, Elaine, is, why do we collect this data? How do we collect this data? And by that I mean, there's every reason why we would only have collected every call and log that as one, and that's it, and that would be this graph here. But of course, the richness of this is knowing that the length of time on the call really changed and transformed over COVID. And I'm wondering, was that an engagement with the DCOs who were saying something's not being captured here? And how does that process work?
Yeah, so all of the data that we collect and the whole RCNI data collection system, it really was built from the ground up. And I always say, and I say this in the training that I provide to data collection officers and to database users all the time, it starts with the survivor. And really the first thing that we wanted to do was reflect the survivor experience and to reflect how they are accessing and how they are using Rape Crisis Centre services. So it was kind of a natural kind of chicken and egg scenario, I suppose. Rape crisis centres are constantly responding to survivors and making sure that they can give them the access that they need. So they will accept, all forms of contact. There's emails, there's social media, people can send letters in, they can contact them through any form that they feel suits them. And we will try to meet that. So when we were collecting the data, we've a few different options. So basically, if you want to put in that the person made a phone call, then the next logical thing was, well, what was the length of that call? But if you want to put in, if you enter that, well, it was a text message or an email, then we ask, well, was it a single contact or was there multiple contacts? Because we're trying to reflect two things. And it's exactly what you'd laid out in the introduction, actually. It's that notion of it's the access and almost the administrative stuff in terms of providing the service. And then there's also the patterns and linking the use of services to the pattern of sexual violence. And if those two things impact each other. And even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking, I'd love to do more research on that, because this is just the top line stuff. And this is always what I find every year. It's like, exactly as you say, it's, there's some really good questions coming in there on the Q&A. And I'm looking at them going, yeah, I'd love to look into that, to be able to pull out that information and to do more in-depth reports all the time. There's a wealth of information in here.
Yeah, no, I think we're clear that we don't know what we're collecting until survivors tell us, until the centres tell us what that experience is on the ground. So we always have to be open to have that feedback loop going, and look at what we can add. And I think this is the perfect example in terms of duration of call. There was something really important we would have missed had we not started collecting duration of call. In terms of what this data is telling us. I'll just move quickly on to the next slide here, Bernard. And as I talked to you beforehand, and I was saying, look, one of the things that really interests us is this this 12% professional part of that pie chart. One of the things that I think you alluded to it earlier, and I certainly, in terms of the response, I think it's always been part of the rape crisis model. But what really came to the fore, and I think people are experiencing it both with the pandemic and I think with the Ukraine crisis as well now, is just how important the relationship with the various professionals and the various other stakeholders within the community are, and the role that a specialist organisation like a rape crisis centre plays in that community, in being able to bring that support structure and information to all the other professionals, because ultimately this is about putting the survivor at the centre of our service. So I'm interested in that 12% professional. I suppose it's a question, this pie chart for me is about that local collaboration. So that's something you've looked at as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very traditional view of helplines, and that it's always the survivor or the person with the experience of the issue that's contacting them. And if you look at addiction support helplines over many years, you found an increasing prevalence of families or people close to a person with addiction struggling to know where to go and what to do. And it became very obvious, I think, that the people who operate and run, and the organizations that run helplines, are very often the people with enormous expertise, with experience, with the knowledge of where somebody can go and not go. Some might say, well, God, if even that number of professionals are contacting the helpline, is that not a sad reflection in terms of, shouldn't they know as professionals already what to do? I actually think it's a very positive thing that professionals are going to where they see the source of expertise to get a view on how to help somebody who has maybe connected with them, who trusts them, has presented to them, who has alluded to or even fully disclosed sexual violence, and the professional is looking to know how to best help that person. That help might be connecting them directly to RCC, it might be connecting them to legal advice, might be connecting them to the Gardaí. So I think it's a very positive thing when we go beyond that traditional notion of the helpline, and we start now to see it more as an available expertise and resource and support that's there to help other people, as opposed to just the victims themselves. So that was my thought on it. And still within that, obviously the majority, over 3/4 there, contacting the survivors who contact the helplines. Of course, that has to be its primary function. And that goes back perhaps to the earlier conversation, that I think maybe the increased confidence people have to come and make that initial contact. That's what that says to me. And supporters, again, I'd put supporters along with the professionals. I think it's two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. And I suppose a lot of these are coming through, the local helpline that the local rape crisis centre is running, and certainly we would know that building up of those relationships, the way that people get to know each other on the ground, so that there is that really smooth flow of information and support, and appropriate support and appropriate referral, because what you want, I suppose, for the survivor is the least steps possible to what is right for them at that time, which may not be what the Rape Crisis Centre is offering. It may be something else that can be informed by the specialists within a Rape Crisis Centre. Certainly, I think one of the reflections for myself is that, in terms of that awareness that you talked about, and I'd certainly in the zero tolerance strategy, is that this is about mobilising the whole of community around this problem, because we've recognised that it takes all of us to prevent sexual violence, and that means that we are engaged with our communities, and everybody has their level of engagement, but also knows where to go to get the specialist expertise and the advice and information when they need it. And it's really positive for us that we do get people coming to us rather than making assumptions around it. So this slide here, if I can move you on, is for me, I think is a question about capacity, because first of all, when you looked at this, you went, great, there's much more service being delivered here in 2020, but having been and you were with us in the room at times, Bernard. You know, the weekly, the bi-weekly meetings with managers as they adapted to this change, which was, you know, replicated across many sectors. And we know that what happened in that yellow spike at the top there in 2020 was that volunteers and counsellors were really going above and beyond. And I would, I suppose, call this sort of the 2020 line in many ways is an artificial capacity, because people didn't take their leave, they worked above and beyond, they worked overtime, etc. So it was never a sustainable capacity, it was a crisis capacity. And the levelling off is understandable there. But of course, Tusla did put more resources into the sector. And in some ways, when you look at this in terms of the capacity and the service that is being delivered, it really is very tied. I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's completely tied to the capacity that centres have. And I think what it doesn't tell the story of is the unmet need out there. So I suppose it's a reflection on when we how do we go about the mapping of and the meeting of the unmet need, and where do we go with this graph into the future, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it's an enormous challenge again, and not to dilute it in any way, but it's right across that spectrum of health and personal social services. There are a lot of variables. I know, certainly having worked in the health service for over 30 years before I came to Tusla, that there's a lot of talk about capacity and demand and supply, and there is also the hidden variable of unmet need. And very often it's only when you provide a service that you start to actually see the significance of the demand for it. So that I think is a factor. I think the levelling off 2020 to 21 is reflective of there was that enormous surge in 2020 with COVID. But can I also say I wouldn't pass over 2020 too quickly. Rape crisis centres, even the 7 reflected in this, but I think it's reflected across the sector. Rape crisis centres, went from 12,000 appointments 2019 to 15,194 in 2020. A lot of the talk about what was happening in 2020 was around essential, inverted commas, services. We talked about blue light services, emergency departments, hospitals, ICUs, very understandably and very appropriately. This of itself was a hidden part of that emergency response. It did get some periodic coverage. And so I think it's important to reflect that that did happen as essential, apart from what it says about need. I think when you come to the 2021 and our earlier discussion about increase in people's maybe comfort and awareness and trends in disclosing and reporting, there is no doubt that we're going to have to continue to find ways to increase capacity to respond in what I call the protective response or the care response, while still heavily investing for many years to come in the prevention response. And I have 2 concerns about it. So apart from the obvious concern, which is just the availability of resource, and rape crisis centre funding has increased in some cases by 50% since 2017, but that's not a badge of honour because it came from a very low base, and I think we have to recognise that. But the concern I have, even if you put money aside, which isn't always a wise thing to do, but if you put money aside for a second, is the actual availability of skill set. And like so many other sectors, the availability of professional skill set, and there is no doubt that the evidence again would show that the capacity, ability and training of counsellors and psychotherapists and others who specialise in this type of work, that does dramatically affect the outcome for people. And so we don't just need to build an availability of money to support the sector. We need to build an availability of a supply of professionals. And we need to look, I think, into other sectors where we also have counselling psychology and associated therapy, and see can we, within their existing work, be it in primary care or other areas, can we add to the toolkit that would help in the overall response? Because I don't think the response can come just within the parameters of the Rape Crisis Centre itself. I don't think the capacity will be there in the future if we stay just with that singular piece. I think it's a multidisciplinary response, and building capacity across other disciplines is going to be as much a part of the pragmatic response to the demand.
And I think that that's reflected in that 12% pie chart we looked at earlier. I did say I wasn't going to set you up in any of these, Bernard, but I am making a list of things I'm coming back to you for with the with the demands and asks that you've semi committed to here, in principle at least. Anyway, I'll just come very quickly to the last slide, and I think this gets us more into this is a slide just to reflect more on the business of data itself before I come to the Q&A. And thank you very much for the Q&As. We will come to, I know we've put a few written responses in, but we will come verbally to some of them as well. The question we had around this, or the thoughts I suppose that was provoked in this particular slide, was one around the 62% who don't report. Now, oftentimes we're asked to explain that. And of course, one of the, it's a complex one to explain, but part of it is that people are coming to rape crisis centres at all periods of their life. They may be coming decades after the event, the incident, or they may be coming with an incident that happened last year. So reporting, there's a lot of variables involved in this. But at the end of the day, this is what's in this database, is 62% of people who are not known to the formal authorities, who haven't reported either to the guards or the likes of yourselves, Tusla. And so this is a silent 62% as far as the statutory sector is concerned. But for this one location where their voice gets included in these statistics, and through these statistics become part of the toolkit that you have to hand in terms of the evidence that you can build both service responses on and policy to the extent that you have the mandate to do policy, but certainly the government driving policy on the back of these. I mean, I suppose the question around the level at which we enable this access and this voice to be heard through this type of initiative in terms of data. I suppose there's a range of questions there, but I'll start with that one. I could keep talking, but I really want to hear you from yourself.
Okay, so I think the not reported, again, not to dilute it, I don't think it's just specific to this issue, although I think it has a uniqueness in this issue to some degree. The not reported, I guess, ultimately, firstly, as the State Child Protection Agency, and as you know, and we've had many engagements on it, where it involves the experience of childhood, then we not only support but are very clear what the legislation tells us about mandatory reporting. But of course, from the data today, also we see people who have experiences as adults and ultimately are left with that dreadful challenge of, on the one hand, the awful experience they've had, the other, if they're able to seek support and help from people like rape crisis centres, and then the third, are they able to, do they feel able to report, to take that to a different level of, be it accountability or just even a sense of validation of their experience. I think it's such a complex and personal issue, and I think you've rightly said that you encounter people at so many different points in times in their lives with different experiences. I don't think people who experience sexual violence in their lives are an homogenous group of people to whom we can attribute a particular rationale behind any particular time in their life, whether it's about reporting or about seeking help. So I think it's a good piece of data. But what might be behind it, as Elaine says, I think it's a whole research in itself. And again, it begs the opposite question to what I said earlier about the trend in reporting. Do people feel inhibited to report? In other words, is it the person's own view of their own experience where they're at, or is it actually their view of society and how society or public services might view them or treat them or respond to them? And I think all we can do is be as encouraging, as supportive, and as open as we can be in our discourse as a society and as public services, and hope that that continues to encourage people. But what the full analysis of that question is, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it certainly is something that, well, through this data and through the conversations with those survivors, we might be able to bring some evidence to the table. But I think there's deeper research around it, and the Rape and Justice in Ireland research is almost 10 years old now, isn't it? Well, actually more than 10 years old. And that did a piece of research with about 100 survivors at that point. But I suppose one of the things it tells us, and I'll just bring it to yourself there, Elaine, but well, one is on the front line, that 62%, one of the things that we need to do is to continue to protect their access, and to make sure that they have this space to, in whatever way they on their terms, and in as far as we can, to protect that access. But I suppose, Elaine, one of the questions for me is, if this 62% are they're appearing in our data, they're here, they've popped into, if you like, public view, and they can be counted through this database. But of course, the landscape is much broader and bigger in terms of the issue and the problem. So how does this data speak to the bigger set of responsibilities our society has around sexual violence in terms of that response?
Well, I'm a big believer in evidence. You know, I think it's absolutely necessary to drive services, to inform services. You know, if you don't know what you're providing services to or what the issue is, then how can you provide an adequate service? I'm also a big believer in, protecting that survivor space. Survivors come to rape crisis centres because they trust the model. We're independent, we're charity-based. We have 40 years of history of centering the survivor or the victim, and, you know, amplifying their voice. And our data tries to do that as well, or I try to do that as best as possibly can within the data. And I think then, in terms of, you know, using other services, it's important, okay, that we have our own data collection system. We have our own system. We are data controllers of the data. We protect that data just as we protect the survivor, we protect their identity. And in terms then, I suppose, of looking at the whole, maybe the survivor journey, or looking at the bigger picture of sexual violence, it's really important that our data is comparable. You know, so when we add categories into our own data collection system, the first thing I'm doing is I'm looking at what the CSO are doing. I'm looking at what the European Institute of Gender Equality are doing, what they're doing, you know, European, international, Irish level. What are the guards doing? What are all these different really important systems doing, that we can find similarity in what we are collecting? We have a safe space for survivors. We collect their data within that space, but if we all collect things using, say, the same definitions or the same indicators, if we have the same types of questions, it means that our data is comparable to other people's data if they're using the same things, if they're asking the same question, if they have the same definition of rape, say, that we do, if they have the same definition of what is a child, really basic stuff. And then that allows us to look at the bigger picture stuff. And I'm not talking about handing survivor data over or anything like that, but I'm talking about that we have comparable data sets, so we can look at everything. We can look at all of these patterns. That would be my take on it.
Bernard, you've got a complex set of data coming into you. How do you tell the big picture And how does this piece of data fit in?
Well, I think individual line data that we get like this piece today, within the service, initially the domestic sexual gender-based violence team, we look at that and we try to assimilate that into what does it tell us, like Elaine, what's the evidence base for the decisions that we make. And sometimes that can be complex, because you not only have potentially information that can be an evidence base, but as you know, different people will interpret that in different ways. So some might say, look, it's suggestive that you heavily invest more in prevention, others might say more in responsive service, and so on. So it can mean different things. We collect an enormous amount of data right across the child protection, child welfare and family support system, the school education welfare system, the adoption information and tracing services, the community and voluntary sector of 600 organisations that we fund. So it's an enormous amount of information. What we're increasingly now trying to do is move to a model of business analytics, and I don't want to use the word business in any pejorative sense towards personal social services, but actually really trying to triangulate all of the information we have and say, what does that tell us about what we're actually doing? And is what we're doing the best way to do what we can do with what we have? That's the piece, I think, that comes through a little bit today that you don't always get in a data set. So you get that lens of survivor experience or survivor profile, and that probably is as powerful as what the numbers themselves might say.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm conscious we have 10 minutes left. We have a lot of questions here to get through. Now, I think some of them we've covered some of the issues, so I'm not get specifically to your question, but I will try to. I'll take one at the top there about the data itself, Elaine. Has the pandemic had an impact on how quickly people report the violence? Is that something we can tell from our data?
It wouldn't really be in our data set, and the reason being is so most people who come to rape crisis centres, it's because they were subjected to child sexual violence, and that usually is historical. And actually, when you look at the number of people who do actually make a report to a formal authority, most of them have reported before they actually come to the rape crisis centre. So in terms of answering that, and looking at, I suppose, how quickly people report, I would be looking more there at, I suppose, what the CSO have or the Garda data sets. And I'm not sure if they have that information, actually, to be perfectly honest. Maybe it's a separate piece of research, a more qualitative piece that needs to be done on that.
I think we do measure how long after the incident, but I think that would take a little more time for that to come through, the changes in trends there.
Yeah, and also, but we're also, I suppose, we're not recording when they reported, as in what date. So it was something actually, and again, we're constantly making changes to the system. We try things, and if it doesn't work, you know, we get rid of it. We try it a different way. See, because when we started this 17 years ago, there was no model. There was no one else doing this. So we had to create the wheel, essentially. So in many ways, yeah, we did try to collect stuff on dates reported and stuff like that, but it just wasn't, it just was unwieldy. It wasn't reliable. So no, I don't think we won't be able to tell that within our own data set.
There's a question here about the switch there has been to text and online, the use of text and online, and if that correlates with age. I suspect that's a broader trend than ourselves, and I think that's probably across society. But I'm just putting it to you in case you have any insights there, or if we can correlate there, Elaine.
Yeah, so really, I suppose what we were seeing was when lockdown happened, that first lockdown in March 2020, counsellors gave their phone numbers to survivors. So they had direct contact with each other around scheduling appointments, rescheduling. There was a lot of flexibility offered there. you know, people were stuck at home. And for many survivors, that was very difficult and very triggering. And that's actually one of the reasons we think that we see this spike in the number of appointments at that time. But so the text message thing, I actually think it's an Irish cultural thing, that we do text messages in this country. We seem to, it's a popular thing here. And I think in terms of rescheduling appointments, it was easier to just, instead of phoning someone, to do it by text. So there'd be lots of back and forth in terms of schedule appointments, or, you know, saying, oh, I can't now, such and such is in the house, I didn't think they would be here, whatever it was. Between the age, this is an interesting one. So on our helpline, yeah, we do collect the age of the caller. Okay, it's going to be more accurate if the person is attending the Rape Crisis Centre, as you know, if they have appointments and they're seen, they're assigned to a counsellor, because at some point you more than likely would have sat across from this person, so you can kind of tell what age they are, because we're not collecting dates of birth or, you know, anything like that from a person. But often on the helpline, someone rings and you can kind of guess an age, and a lot of it is kind of around helpline stuff. There is a bit of guesswork involved, but often that that data it's a bit iffy, to be perfectly honest. But I will go back and I will look at, of the people who were ringing helplines who actually were existing clients, we'll say, or service users in centres who had, you know, were going for counselling and support. I can check if there is a correlation there between age and whether they were using text messages or phone calls. I'm sure there is something. I'm sure there is, but definitely I will check that.
And Bernadette, I presume that trend is being reflected elsewhere and across the board. And I suppose one of the questions that we've had is, does it change the quality of what we're providing in terms of the service?
I think we have to look at that both ways. Again, I wouldn't necessarily have the expertise to say in specific remit of the counselling world. I know some counsellors said the adaptation to online support for people, that they would call it more support than maybe deep therapeutic counselling, but that they also felt there was an enormous advantage to some of the people using that service, in that it was even more accessible and more relaxed in certain cases. And that's in the wider rebate outside of sexual violence. I do think equally, though, we can't dismiss the quality of contact because it might be digital, that it might be text, it might be online, it might be web text, or other type of service. You look at Childline, for example, doing an enormous work on web chat and web support for people. How much that works in just pure text, I can't say. I'm assuming it's a level of support, but the digital world is the world of a whole generation now, and it's the future of a whole generation. And I think the challenge for personal social services is to see how far we can go in providing responses to people without compromising the efficacy of what's being done, but at the same time interacting with that world. If you look at the number of young people Elaine talked about in the data, well, those young people might just well want to talk to you by text or by Snapchat or by web chat, and isn't it better they're doing that than not doing that?
I think I'm going to give the last question here to one about resources. I'm going back to that try that familiar old place rather than the more sort of speculative. But I suppose the question here is the increase in monthly appointments between 2019 and 21. Were more staff hired to meet demand, or were the services under pressure? And I've parsed that answer myself, but I think I'll put it over to yourself, Bernard, in terms of Tusla's response in terms of supporting the centre.
Okay, so I mentioned a couple of moments ago the headline figure of increasing rape crisis support from 2017 by 50%, and I genuinely say that for what it is. I don't say it as I said, as a kind of badge of honour for Tusla, because that's not what it's about, nor should it be about. This isn't about Tusla. This is about the level of resource and support that's available. And equally, I'm the first to accept that that's from a low base. You know, rape crisis centres, quite similar to domestic violence refuges. I often describe them as being quite similar to the hospice movement in terms of how it grew up in Ireland. It grew out of that local, altruistic response to a local need that somebody identified and championed. And I think we have to recognise that that's where it's come from, like a lot of our personal social services. Overall, the domestic violence sector, including sexual violence, since 2019, in terms of Tusla's funding of protection services, has increased from about 25 million to 31 million or so this year. You and I talked during the pandemic, and we made available to people additional in-year help where we could, to see if people could get extra counselling hours to try and deal with things like waiting lists and so on. In-year help in 1 year isn't always good because there's no continuity to that, and we recognise that. But we did it, I think we did it in good faith as an additional response and a recognition of pressure, more than we did with the 24-hour helplines when we felt in the Christmas bridging 2020 and 2021 that they were going to be surged with demand. And so, yeah, look, it depending on which lens you approach resource question from, there are many different perspectives on it. The one thing I would say, to be fair, I think is, whatever about the value judgment of not enough or not enough too soon enough, I would say that certainly the evidence of the last 3 years has shown a steady increase. I think the evidence has shown a steady, sincere commitment to wanting to not just increase necessarily the volume of money, but the type of resource and how that best works. And I think ultimately, when it comes to a new state agency at hopefully the end of next year, that will even become more solid and evidence-based, and will increase in the appropriate way.
Fabulous. Thank you so very much. I know I am conscious there's a set of questions here which we're not going to get to, but I think I'm going to commit my team to try to answer those in writing where we can. And so my team are a bit concerned that we might cut off at the point here. So if we do, apologies, but just say, Bernard, thank you so very much. Really, really appreciate, as ever, your engagement and your transparency around it, and it's just so I think once we can agree a problem and face into that problem, then the solutions are ahead of us. We can get there, we can see them ahead of us. And of course, I just want to thank Elaine and her whole team on the ground all the way through, and I'm calling them your team in this instance, although of course they are spread across rape crisis centres, which are of course all independent and autonomous in their own right. But it is just an incredible achievement every year, and just day in, day out to produce this data when you're doing crisis work at the front line. And it is so incredibly valuable and important. And I think your presence here today and your reflections on it really inform, tell us that just how connected that survivor walking in the front door of a rape crisis centre right the way through to yourself and the decision makers right at the top. It really matters. This data, making that journey, really matters. So thank you all very, very much. And I hope you and the audience got as much out of it as we did. And I'll be following up, as I say, with a list of asks, Bernard. So I'll be in touch. But thank you all.
It's nice to hear from you. Thanks, Cliona.